Time travel to the past is one of the most confusing and entertaining concepts. Countless movies, books, and TV show episodes have been made exploring the consequences of the idea. Is it possible to go back in time? And if it is, can you really change the past? Or is a time traveler doomed to always fail in their attempts to change the past? One of the most traditional ways to explore consequences of time travel is through the grandfather paradox. The paradox is as follows. For some reason, you want to kill your grandfather in the past, so you go back in time and kill your grandfather before he met your grandmother. This means that your grandfather never met your grandmother and one of your parents was never born, and as a result, you were never born too. You couldn't have traveled back in time and killed your grandfather. If you were never born, you never went back in time and your grandfather never died. He met your grandmother. You existed to travel back in time and kill him. The story repeats itself. Before explaining the possible solutions to the paradox and its implications, I will make it clearer what exactly the paradox is. If it is possible to travel back in time and then carry out this murder, it seems that 1. Your grandfather met your grandmother. 2. Your grandfather died before meeting your grandmother. These two statements need to be true for the scenario of the grandfather paradox to occur. But these two truths are contradictory. They are two logical statements that exclude each other. Your grandfather cannot be alive on the day he met your grandmother. You killed him. But he also has to be alive and have met your grandmother for you to be born and kill him. Your grandfather cannot be alive and dead at the same time. The grandfather paradox is a very rare case of something that is popularly called a paradox actually being a paradox. A scenario where two contradictory statements need to be true at the same time. So how can we resolve the grandfather paradox? There are a few ways, and the most obvious is to state that time travel is impossible. So what does science tell us about time travel? The answer is that we are not sure. Within science, there are basically two camps of opinion. Some physicists advocate for something called the chronology protection conjecture, which is basically the assertion that time travel is impossible according to the laws of nature. Okay, so which law of nature exactly prohibits time travel? Well, no one has discovered a law that prohibits all cases of time travel, but there are some arguments. The most traditional argument is that any time machine inevitably turns into a black hole. Imagine a time machine and then let some energy enter it in the form of radiation. This energy will exit the machine in the past relative to when it entered the machine. Does this mean that part of this energy will indeed enter the time machine a second time? It is impossible to completely shield the entrance of a time machine. Therefore, portions of the initial energy may take a second loop. And if this is true for a single particle of light, it might be enough to collapse the machine into a black hole. The trick is to repeat the argument to assert that part of the energy enters a third, then a fourth, and then a fifth time into the time machine. And then this logic explodes, implying that any time machine will produce infinite energy and collapse into a black hole. On the other hand, there is a group of physicists who argue that time machines are possible. They get around the problem of the time machine turning into a black hole by adding an energy cost across the machine. Basically, a way to pay a toll for time travel to happen. And under the right conditions, this might even prevent the machine from collapsing into a black hole. And here it is important to note that calculations involving time travel are generally difficult. And these arguments are based on approximate calculations. It's not possible to be certain of any result. The truth is that currently, science cannot decide whether time travel is impossible or not based solely on the laws of physics. But fortunately, we can turn to another field of knowledge, philosophy. Let's analyze this paradox as a philosophical paradox without worrying too much about what the laws of nature have to tell us. We've already seen that the grandfather paradox points to a real logical contradiction, which is a scenario that really is impossible. If time travel makes it possible to create a logical contradiction, then time travel is impossible. And that's it. The grandfather paradox is a logical argument against time travel. In the same way, if some mathematical theory one day proves that 1 equals 2, we know that the theory is wrong because 1 and 2 are demonstrably different numbers. If something allows a logically impossible situation, then that something is impossible. It turns out concluding time travel is impossible is a correct interpretation of the grandfather paradox, but it is not the only possible conclusion. The creation of the paradox depends on other factors of the scenario. For the paradox to form, we assume that time travel is possible. You can in fact kill your grandfather in the past. We also assume that the grandfather you kill is exactly your grandfather. And that doesn't have to be the case. This is the idea of alternative timelines. Maybe when you travel through time, you go back to the past. but not exactly to your past. You may have traveled to a past in a universe that until then was identical to yours, until you screwed up by arriving there after time travel. Or perhaps the very act of time traveling splits the universe into two timelines, one in which your grandfather lived and met your grandmother, and another in which you carried out your plan. Adding alternative timelines also resolves the paradox, preserving time travel. There is your original grandfather who has always been alive, met your grandmother and started a family, and there is the grandfather from the alternative universe whom you killed. It is not contradictory that these two grandfathers, technically different, are one dead and the other alive at the same time. There is no paradox in this scenario, but it is also not very satisfying. Indeed, a significant consequence of this solution to the paradox is that you never change your past. You only change an alternative past and definitely avoid any paradox because of that. And of course, this solution also needs some kind of parallel universe to make sense. So it's not a minimalist solution to the grandfather paradox, as it invokes the existence of something like the multiverse. But who knows? There might still be one more possible solution. To review, there are basically three premises in the grandfather paradox. The first is that time travel is possible. The second is that you can reach the right conditions to kill your grandfather. And the third is that the grandfather you killed is exactly the same grandfather who married your grandmother and not an alternative version of your grandfather from another timeline. The only premise that we haven't yet denied to try to solve the paradox is the premise that you can be in the right conditions to kill your grandfather. And there are some ways to solve the grandfather paradox by challenging the idea that it is actually possible to execute this plan. One of them is the idea that it is simply impossible to change what happens in history in any way. The past is already perfectly determined. And even with time travel, nothing you do in any way will allow you to kill your grandfather at all. And initially, this seems like a good solution. And it is, if you agree that free will does not exist. For example, once time travel exists, what exactly is the past and what exactly is the future becomes relative. If time travel exists, it always seems possible to change the past by traveling through time and turning the past into the future. And then we return to the usual grandfather paradox. The solution here is simple. Maybe it is not possible to change even the future. This is a deterministic solution to the grandfather paradox. Both the past and the future already have their facts determined. There are truths about the past that cannot be changed at all. And likewise, there are truths in the future that cannot be changed in any way whatsoever. It's not possible to prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother with time travel. It was never possible to prevent that meeting. The truth of this fact has always been determined, regardless of time travel or not. In this scenario, all of history is like a movie. All the information about what happens is already determined, no matter which part of the movie you are watching. Okay, I know that not everyone likes the idea of this deterministic universe with limited choices. Fortunately, there are other ways to prove it is impossible to change the past without destroying free will. The most popular idea among scientists is probably the Novikov self-consistency principle, also known as the law of conservation of history. The principle states the following: if any event would cause a temporal paradox, then the probability of that event occurring is zero. In other words, since killing your grandfather in the past leads to a paradox, the probability of you succeeding is 0%. Maybe the time machine fails exclusively on this particular trip, or perhaps you arrive in the past and immediately slip on a banana peel, and then you hit your head and unfortunately become unable to carry out your plan. Or maybe you aim your weapon successfully and somehow every shot mysteriously fails. And this is the frightening consequence of the Novikov principle. By making the possibility of creating a paradox zero, that probability has to shift to other less likely events. If the chance of your weapon failing when firing normally is less than 1%, then when you try to cause a paradox with it, the chance of it mysteriously failing increases to 100%. A weapon that works perfectly in any other possible scenario will always fail to kill your grandfather. Time travel might be 100% possible according to the laws of physics, but completely impossible by logic, which creates absolutely absurd situations, worthy of a cartoon. And all this to prevent time travelers from succeeding in changing the past. The idea that the probability of creating time paradoxes is zero can be used in an even more radical way. Once you have traveled to the past, there are countless actions that can cause possible paradoxes. And these events must all have zero probability. So it is much more likely that any attempt to travel to the past will fail, even if time travel is physically possible. In fact, here is a macabre consequence. If your grandson from a hypothetical future is going to invent time travel, it increases your chances of dying or becoming infertile before having children, because this would prevent time travel and reduce the chance of any paradoxes to zero, exactly according to the Novichok principle. And that's exactly why future me couldn't stop current me from posting this video. The chance of him creating a paradox is zero, and it was too late for the alternative. Thank you very much and see you next time.